Guys, it's me, Miss Norris, and today I'd like to share a read aloud book with you in honor of Black History Month. Today I'd like to share the story of Henry's Freedom Box. Henry's Freedom Box is based on a true story about the Underground Railroad and was written in 2007 by Ellen Levine and illustrated by Kadir Nelson. It tells the story of Henry and his Freedom Box. And if you're ready to hear the story, I'm ready to share it with you. Here we go. Henry's Freedom Box. Henry Brown wasn't sure how old he was. Henry was a slave, and slaves weren't allowed to know their birthdays. Could you imagine not knowing when your birthday was? Henry and his brothers and sisters worked in the big house where the master lived. Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family, but Henry's mother knew things could change. Do you see those leaves blowing in the wind? They are torn from the trees like slave children are torn from their families. So, right now, everything seems pretty good. But Henry's mother says, you see these leaves and how their leaves can just be blown away? That's what happens to slaves' children. Someday, Henry, you might be blown away from me and we won't ever be together again. Isn't that scary and sad? One morning, the master called for Henry and his mother. They climbed the wide staircase. The master lay in bed with only his head above the quilt. He was very ill. He beckoned them to come closer. Some slaves were freed by their owners. Henry's heart beat fast. Maybe the master would set him free. But the master said, You are a good worker, Henry. I am giving you to my son. You must obey him and never tell a lie. Henry nodded, but he didn't say thank you. That would have been a lie. So Henry did not get freedom. The master gave Henry to his son. Could you imagine someone being able to give you to someone else like you were a present or a gift? And your mom not being able to help you or save you? That's pretty scary. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. Free bird, happy bird, Henry thought. Henry said goodbye to his family. He looked across the field. The leaves swirled in the wind, just like he and his family are being swirled apart. So everyone's coming to say goodbye. People are trying not to cry. Henry worked in his new master's factory. He was good at his job. Do not tear that tobacco leaf, the boss yelled at the new boy. He poked the boy with a stick. If you made a mistake, the boss would beat you. It doesn't mean like in a race. It means that if you didn't do the job that your master wanted you to do, they could just beat you up if they wanted to, and no one could do anything about it. It was a really different time, and it was scary and sad. Henry was lonely. One day he met Nancy, who was shopping for her mistress. They walked and talked and agreed to meet again. Henry felt like singing, but slaves didn't dare sing in the streets. Instead, he hummed all the way home. So, Henry has met a woman that he thinks is wonderful, and they've agreed to see each other again. But you can see other people are looking on. They don't agree with the slaves being able to have their own families and care for one another. Slaves were not treated as though they were people. Imagine how that would feel. Months later, Henry asked Nancy to be his wife. When both their masters agreed, Henry and Nancy were married. So they had to get permission to get married. Soon there was a little baby, then another and another. Henry knew they were very lucky. They lived together even though they had different masters. But Nancy was worried. Her master had lost a great deal of money. "I'm afraid he will sell our children," she said. Let that sink in. "I'm afraid they're going to sell my babies, my children." Henry sat very still. Henry worked hard all morning. He tried to forget what Nancy said. Forget what Nancy had said. So he's trying not to think about the idea that somehow his children could just be taken away from him, like his mom said, like leaves blowing off a tree. His friend James came into the factory. He whispered to Henry, "Your wife and children were just sold at the slave market." "No!" cried Henry. Henry couldn't move. He couldn't think. He couldn't work. "Twist that tobacco," the boss poked Henry. Henry twisted tobacco. Twisted tobacco leaves. His heart twisted in his chest. So he's just found out that his family has been sold, and his boss isn't giving him any time to feel sad. He just pokes at him and says, "Get back to work." At lunchtime, Henry rushed to the center of town. A large group of slaves was tied together. The owner shouted at them. Henry looked for his family. "Father! Father!" Henry watched his children disappear down the road. Where was Nancy? He saw her the same moment she saw him. When he wiped away his tears, Nancy too was gone. So he's come to town to find his family. His kids are scared. They want their dad. They don't know where their mom is. And you can see that Henry is very scared. Henry no longer sang. He couldn't hum. He went to work, and at night he ate supper and went to bed. Henry tried to think of happy times, but all he could see were the carts carrying away everyone he loved. Henry knew he would never see his family again. He's very sad. He doesn't want to even sing or hum anymore. His family is gone, and he knows he's never going to see them ever again. Many weeks passed. One morning, Henry heard singing. A little bird flew out of a tree into the open sky, and Henry thought about being free. But how? He lifted a crate, and he knew the answer. He asked James and Dr. Smith to help him. Dr. Smith was a white man who thought slavery was wrong. They met early the next day at the empty warehouse. Henry arrived with a box. "I will mail myself to a place where there are no slaves," he said. James stared at the box, then at Henry. "What if you cough or someone hears you?" I will cover my mouth and hope, said Henry. So Henry's idea is to get in a box and mail himself to another place. So at this time, there were states that allowed slavery and there were states that didn't. And Henry was going to mail himself to a place where they didn't allow slaves to be anymore. This is very dangerous. Dr. Smith wrote on the box, to William H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Henry would be delivered to friends in Philadelphia. Then he printed on the crate in big letters, this side up with care. So if he's in the box, he doesn't want the box to turn over, and Dr. Smith is helping mail him to a friend. Henry needed an excuse to stay home, or the work boss would think he had run off. James pointed to Henry's sore fingers, but Henry knew it wasn't bad enough. He opened a bottle of oil of vitriol. No! Cried James. Henry poured it on his hands. It burned his skin to the bone. Now the boss would have to let him stay home. Dr. Smith bandaged Henry's hand. They arranged to meet the next morning at 4 o'clock. Dun, dun, dun. So Henry just hurt himself on purpose so that he would have a good reason to go see the doctor and to not have to be at work. If his hand is hurt, he can't tear the tobacco leaves. But he's really hurt. The sun was not up yet when Henry climbed into the box. Ready? He said. James nailed down the lid. Dr. Smith and James drove to the station. The railway clerk tipped the box over and nailed a paper to the bottom. Dr. Smith begged the clerks to be careful, but they didn't listen. They threw the box in the luggage car. So even though it says this side up and handle with care, you wouldn't expect a human being to be in there. And so even if you're handling with care, it's probably still not careful enough for a human being. Hours passed. Henry was lifted up and thrown again, upside down. He heard waves splashing. This must be the steamboat headed for Washington, D.C. The ship rode smoothly, but Henry was still upside down. Blood rushed to his head. His face got hot. His eyes ached. He thought his head would burst. But he was afraid to move. Someone might hear him. So I'm going to get closer so you can see this. You can see he's upside down in the box, and there's no way for him to turn himself over. And so imagine hanging upside down for hours and hours, and how hard that your head might hurt. But you can't make a sound because you're hiding. Excuse me. I'm tired of standing, someone said. Why don't we move that box and sit on it, said another. Henry held his breath. Could they be talking about his box? So he's very clearly upside down. You see his head, and they've turned the box on its side, and then on its other side, they're kind of rolling the box. Henry, yes, were they talking about his box? Henry was pushed. The box scraped the deck, but now he was on his right side, now on his left, and suddenly, boom, right side up. So it took a while, but finally he got straightened up and put this side up, actually up. What do you think this is in here? Said the first man. Male, I guess, said the other. I am male, thought Henry, but not the kind they imagined. Henry was carried off the steamboat and placed in a railroad car. This time, heads up. He fell asleep to the rattling song of the train wheels. So you can see the guys are sitting on top of Henry's box, and they're wondering what's inside this box. And they think it's mail, like that you go to a post office, but it's mail, like a man. Kind of right. He awoke to a loud knocking. Henry, are you all right in there? All right, he answered. The cover was pried open. Henry stretched and stood up. 4 men smiled at him. Welcome to Philadelphia. At last, Henry had a birthday, March 30th, 1849, his first day of freedom. And from that day on, he also had a middle name. Everyone called him Henry Box Brown because he came out of a box. But remember the very first thing we read, that Henry did not know when his birthday was, but his Freedom Day is what he considers his new birthday. And this was based on a true story. I will read what the author's note says. It says, in the mid-1800s, there were about 4 million slaves living in the United States. Slaves were owned like tables or cows or wagons. Historians believe that 60,000 and 100,000 slaves escaped to freedom traveling on what is called the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad wasn't a real railroad. It was all the secret ways slaves made their way from the South to the North. They hid in carts, rode on horseback, walked hundreds of miles through forests and swamps, and crossed flowing rivers in summer and icebound rivers in the winter. Conductors and station masters hid them and helped them throughout their journey. When Henry Brown climbed into his freedom box, he hoped he'd be carried to a safe world. He brought along a small tool to make air holes, a little water, and a few biscuits, like crackers. Henry arrived in Philadelphia having traveled 350 miles from Richmond, Virginia, in 27 hours. His story made newspaper headlines in America and Europe. Henry never found Nancy and his children. In 1850, he went to England, and there are some reports that he married again. We do not know with absolute certainty that Henry Box Brown became one of the most famous runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad, the man who mailed himself to freedom. The end. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you really enjoyed the story Henry's Freedom Box and thought that it was interesting and special. If you did, please hit that thumbs up button at the bottom of the page. If you're already a subscriber, thank you so much for your support. It really means a lot to me. If you're not a subscriber yet, please click that subscribe button down at the bottom of the page, and don't forget to click the bell so that you're notified when there's new content. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to say a big thank you to the Howie family for loaning me such a well-curated bunch of books to celebrate and honor Black History Month. Thank you, Howie family, and I hope to see you all again real soon. Bye-bye.